This is going to be a book review of The Lean Startup by ries. It's a book just about like startup and kind of entrepreneurial stuff. So I'm going to be going through it pretty quickly and looking at some of my notes here that I took. So really what this book is about is it is really focusing on the whole journey of a startup, and it gets into a lot of the nitty gritty and the whole idea of what a lean startup is. Lean startup is a startup that can, very quickly adapt to changing times and take advantage of them in order to become successful. It really emphasized in the beginning that your number one priority before you build anything is to focus on whether or not you actually need to build anything. What does that mean? Focus on whether a product even needs to be built. If you are trying to, create a solution for people, but people don't even need the solution, why are you building stuff? It doesn't matter if you're efficiently doing something that shouldn't be done in the first place. I think that's one of the big takeaways of this book. A lot of people in the startup area are very efficient at building a huge, really nice product. Maybe it's an app, maybe it's a lot of other things. And because they wait all that time before getting feedback, once they get feedback, they realize that they shouldn't have built that. They should have built something else. And then they just wasted a bunch of time. So instead, what this book is really proposing is you work in small batches, and throughout the batches, you expose some of the customers or some of your ideal clients to the product or to the prototype to get their feedback, so that way you can constantly iterate before you launch it and release it to everybody. It says that the best startups are somewhere between chaos and overly bureaucratic management. So you don't want purely chaos. The idea that all startups have to move fast and break things is really incorrect, because that's just not true. And every industry that your startup is in is very different. And of course, we don't want largely bureaucratic management, because that's not necessary, and it slows things down. A big emphasis of this book is the idea of useful learning. So you need to do the right kind of useful learning to maximize the insight and awareness you have of your market, product, and customers. This also saves time and resources. Too many people focus on building, but they are sailing without a direction. So you want to learn from your failures and your experiences as you build a startup, but you want to make sure you're doing the right kind of learning. If you keep repeating the same thing over and over again, you're not really learning anything from that. But if you do something once and then realize, oh, my product shouldn't actually be this, it should be this, because this is what the market wants. Or my customers aren't who I thought they were, they're actually this group of people. That is more insightful, useful learning that can then help you and go forward. And if you do this learning earlier in the process, so typically what people do, okay, I create a startup. I'm going to make an app. Okay, I make the whole app. I release it. I realize nobody wants it because it doesn't have this one feature. Okay, I go back to the beginning. Now I change the app and I add that one feature. Then I release it. Then I realize, oh wait, someone also wants another thing, and now I have to go back and change that because nobody will use it without that. Like, all of that needs to be changed in the fact that we should first start with understanding what people want, make a really terrible prototype that just barely works because that's the fastest thing we can make, or now with AI, maybe you can make something better, hopefully, and then release it as soon as possible to a couple people who are in your ideal customer base, and then have them rate it, and then incorporate that feedback and just do that again and again and again until you have a very good product. A very good product is not one that is just beautiful and amazing. It's one that's actually built off of the customer feedback and what your ideal people you're trying to sell to actually want. I think a lot of people get this confused. They want a super polished thing, but this polished thing would be great if it's polished with what your customers want. But if it's polished with what your ideas of the market are, and that market isn't actually like that, it doesn't help at all. It's not relevant at all. It doesn't even matter at all. And that's what he points out, that a lot of startups are failing because of that, because they kind of construe what they think the whole market and opportunity that they have as a startup is, and they don't ground themselves in reality. So yeah, as a takeaway from that, another note I put is just confirm there's a need from your customers first before you spend all this time building a product. Because really at the end of the day, yeah, maybe you can raise more money from investors and it's fine, but you waste a bunch of your own time, which is not ideal. Also, realize that not all metrics are useful. There's vanity metrics versus actionable metrics. Vanity metrics are usually just typically growth. And a really big insight I had from this book was that You can have growth from something you did very early on. So let's say in the very beginning days of my startup, I do XYZ. I make a decision to make the landing page blue instead of white or something, right? And because of it's blue, it attracts more people. And then as I continue to build the startup, I realized, wow, my numbers just keep growing. But then instead, let's say I work on maybe changing the paragraphs on the website, and maybe I tweak some words. And I think that the tweaking of the words is causing the growth. But in reality, what's causing the growth is the original blue that I chose for the background of the website. And that is still causing more growth. So that's a short little kind of fictional example of how convoluted and complex it is to actually get the root problem of what is causing your problems and what is causing your growth. Because whatever was causing your growth, you need to double down on that, right? Because that's actually going to push you forward. And a lot of times he says these startups, what they do is they use these vanity metrics and they get caught lost in this huge sea of problems where they're doing a lot of things that don't matter at all. And they think they are, but it's actually not what's pushing their product forward, pushing their startup forward and getting them towards success. So it says MVP is mainly to gather interest, so adding any features beyond less than bare minimum is a waste of time. You can just run an ad or sign up for a free trial to assess how interested people are in something, then build it later. This is a really good insight because it's like, if you don't have interest, how can you sell something? How can you even sell if there's nobody interested? Yes, to some degree, you have to convince people, but you do need a receptive customer base in the beginning. How do you assess that? You can start by just, sending out emails, ads, like sign up, etc., to see how interested people are. This is actually probably the best thing you want to do. You want to completely flip what people think. People think, oh, I make a product. Once it's done, I release it to the world. No, you want to say, okay, first I see what does the world need. I prove that the world needs this with a lot of customer feedback surveys, all this stuff. Then I'm like, okay, I have all this feedback. I'm going to make a small little prototype. Okay, once I have that prototype, I go give it back to those people. What do they say? I come back, I fix the prototype. What do they say? I come back, fix it. You keep doing this kind of in silence, right? And then eventually, once you're ready for your big launch release, you release it. But you've already done a bunch of iterations under the table. And that's why your prototype is extremely refined, not in a general way, but in the way that your customers want. It has the features they want, it has what they actually need, what they actually will use, and it also effectively converts them to be your customer. Split A/B testing is the highest yield way to determine if changes you are making are actually causing the effects you're observing. So for example, right, if we go back to what I was talking about with the blue website versus changing the text, if I do A/B testing where some users will see a blue versus a white website and then we'll see how many of them sign up versus I change some of the words and then we just see how many of them sign up. The change in percent of how many users sign up based off of the change that we made, whether the blue website or white website, or the change in the paragraph or not changing paragraph, it reveals to you that, hey, this doesn't matter. You would start to realize that maybe the paragraph doesn't do anything, that changing doesn't do it, and you're just completely wasting your time by trying to fix that and optimize it. And in reality, what users actually care about is maybe the blue or the white landing page website. And from there, you can decide to spend more time, more resources on what truly matters. But a lot of startups don't do split A/B testing, and then so they just live in this world where they think they're doing things that matter, but they're actually just wasting their time, and they're slowly dying out because they're not doing the correct things that are going to propel them forward. So yeah, the split A/B testing is the key to grounding yourself in reality, right? This is what's going to help you determine the cause-effect relationship, which can seem almost impossible to link at times in a startup. The way I view a startup is your job is to solve 1 million little problems correctly, and if you miss 5 or more of those problems, you will likely fail. It's that's just how I kind of view it, right? So you want to make sure that you have as many of those problems, you answer them correctly, you solve them in the correct way as well, right? It's not only do you just solve them, you need to solve them in the best way possible in order for you to succeed. This is why startups are so hard, they're so complicated, and as of right now, why I wouldn't personally do one, right? But it's just a very comprehensive thing, right? And so you can imagine if you're trying to solve this very difficult math problem, let's say, but your understanding of fundamental addition is just wrong, it's going to be completely off. That's the same with a startup. If your fundamental assumption about the market you are entering, the customers you are serving is just wrong because you haven't done enough time feedback with them, right? Or your product, you think your product is one thing, but the customers view it a different way. How do you expect to be successful? You cannot. You simply cannot, because your vision and your idea is over here and reality is over here. And the two need to be aligned in order for you to actually reach success, right? The two have to be aligned for you to even just start and have a chance. But if you're already misaligned, right, there's no way you can possibly go in two different directions because you need the working of the both sides. Okay, it says, some of the notes I took said, pivots are the key to success because as you pivot and try more things out, you get a better picture of the reality, which directs you towards the right direction to concentrate and focus your efforts for success. So for example, let's imagine I was running, right? Or walking and trying to find something. And so you go from left to right. You're like, okay, maybe if I go over here, maybe you lost, let's do this. You lost something and you have your phone out and you have the like tracker here. And maybe it's one of the things that just says warmer or colder. Okay. So warmer would be like you're closer to it. Colder would be like you're farther away. So let's say you start going to the right and all of a sudden it starts saying colder. Well, you'd be like, okay, I went too far this way. I need to start going the other way. So you start going to the left and it says warmer. And then you go a different direction, start saying colder and then warmer. The idea is you have to go in this kind of zigzag pattern, but eventually you get closer and closer and closer and closer to the goal. The same thing with the startups, right? Sometimes you pivot and you learn one thing, you have to pivot again. And maybe you pivot a third time. A lot of the most successful companies pivoted a couple times before they hit what they really needed because with each pivot, they learned something new about the same target audience that they were facing or the same issues that they had, et cetera, and that led them to actually be successful. Also, part of this book really emphasizes that the reason why the MVP should be such like a prototype, so like just bare bones, is because doing things in small batches is actually more efficient than doing things in super large batches. So this book really challenges the idea that a lot of people have from the Industrial Revolution of like, okay, we need to have hyper specialists and they need to work only on the thing they're assigned to, and they'll do tons of that every day and they'll be good at it, right? So an investment banker maybe will only look at certain investment reports and never do anything else, right? And they won't talk to any other people. Their job is just look at reports, determine if it's good or not, and then find better ones, right? Or maybe let's say a coder, all they do is just code. They're not supposed to do anything else, they just code. But he says the problem with this is you have all these people building things that don't matter because the teams of people, right? If you imagine to build a product, you need a coder, a marketer, like a salesperson, et cetera, et cetera. You need a product manager, all those people. But if you emphasize that a coder needs to be coding all the time, there isn't time for actual meetings. And the meetings are the ways of communication. Now, of course, today's meetings are probably very filled with a bunch of nonsense and not super useful, but the idea of a meeting is to convey information. And he says that like a lot of times he does consulting for, let's say, other startups. And once they implement his principles, a lot of the people on the team feel like they're less productive. And that's because society has determined our level of productivity as how much work you can do, but it doesn't determine if it's actually useful or not. It would be better to do less work, but more of that work is actually useful than it is to do more work that's completely useless. Useless work is work that is done in a completely different direction, completely incorrect direction, and that could have been adjusted with more information. And you can't assume that you just do that work and, oh, that's an inevitable kind of reason why we failed, etc. We couldn't avoid that anyway. I don't think so. I think the truth of the matter is if you had more information and you have the opportunity to get more information, let's say by your customers, by your product, by your feedback, and this is all why the author is talking about you need to have these small batches. Because he's saying, okay, for example, he used the envelopes as an example. Imagine you had to send out 100 envelopes. So a lot of times I've also done this too. It's like you lick all the envelopes, then you close all the envelopes, or then you stick all the papers in, then you close all the envelopes. Like you don't do them one by one, you do them in batches because that's how we've been taught. But he was saying, what if, let's say you lick all the envelopes and then you fold all the papers and then you realize the papers don't actually fit in the envelopes. Well, now you have to go back, unfold everything, remove them, throw them away. But if you did one at a time, then you would have realized in the very beginning that something doesn't fit and you have to change your approach. He says this is the goal and the real benefit of small batches, and that yes, maybe in the end the amount of work you do is less, but you figure out all these little issues much faster and you can actually build things that matter and are useful as a result. Instead of just going in the completely wrong direction, but like going very fast and very, strongly in the complete wrong direction. Now, I don't completely agree with this because I think personally, like if you go back to the envelopes example, you do need to do batches, but it's just important to test everything first. Don't just get started without testing, and then you can do batches. And it's also really important for constant communication because imagine if suddenly the next batch, the envelope size changed. That's something we need to like communicate about and change the approach. That's just a kind of example there, right? So it's like constant communication with the team, constant communication back and forth, because that's how you have those insights, and you let the insights build, and then you let the team kind of work on them and make them better using the customer feedback. So yeah, one of the notes I wrote down is that this book just proves there are a million and one things you have to get right to do a startup. A startup has much more uncertainty than a business because it's typically in the very high risk and high reward category, and the uncertainty stems from going in a completely new direction without any previously tested precedent to go off of. Businesses are different in that typically you can copy and refine an existing business model to make money, and it doesn't require a paradigm shift to work. This is personally why I don't see myself like creating a startup, and I kind of don't recommend other people because it's like the most difficult way to do something in a sense. Like if you want to, let's say, provide for your family, you want to have financial stability, you should start a business because business are replicable. You can kind of copy and paste them for the most part, and there's a lot of more certainty than there is with a startup. A startup is really trying to go and extend the bounds of what is humanly possible or also what is known to be possible in this world. And that's an extremely challenging thing. And we also have this thing where it's just like, there's so much survivorship bias. All the successful entrepreneurs are all the stories we ever hear about, but the problem is there's such like 1% chance that you become those people, even if you work really hard, and there's tons of people who just failed. And so as a result, it's just like a whole mess. And I just personally don't think it's like, why would... It's like if you could get to the same goal, but one way was extremely difficult and it had a very low chance of that goal versus another way was pretty difficult, but it had a much higher chance of that goal, you would take the other one, right? That's why I don't understand why people just don't make businesses and like instead of going after a startup. Because a startup, yes, you can change the world, but you have to be clear. If you want to just change the world, go ahead, that's fine. But if you are looking to, actually become successful in like just for yourself mainly, startup may not be the best way in that because you typically takes like 10 years, right? Because you have to fail at multiple startups, you have to learn a lot of hard lessons, and you have to work for many, many hours. And if you poured those hours into a business, like you'd hear about Elon Musk, like 80-hour work weeks, right? And then just for years on end, like that's like cool. But like if you poured that into an existing business model, right, you could refine that business. Let's say, for example, you sold insurance. If you poured that much time, thinking, and thought into like insurance and an existing business model, you made it better and better and better, you could probably be the top 1%, right, of that kind of business model. And that top 1% would allow you to have a lot more opportunities and it would just be like much more stable than even if you, let's say, make a super successful startup like Tesla, right? Even to this day, you're still very concerned about competitors, all these things, right? And it's not, you don't really get to this point where you can just relax. And I think with a lot more legacy business models, like for example, if you had a car wash or like you owned a gas station and you just refined it as much as possible, you could get it to the point where it kind of runs on its own and you can kind of step back from it. But that doesn't really typically happen with startups unless you sell, which again, selling also takes probably a process of about 10 years for the startup to actually like come to fruition. Of course, timelines vary, but I'm just trying to point out that startups really just take a long time and they don't have a great success chance. This was a really good connection back to the Ray Dalio Principles book that I read, and I also did a video on that. So if you haven't, make sure you check that out already. But it tells us to ask why 5 times to get at the true cause of events, because when you ask why that many times, you start to understand what was the part of your machine, part of your startup that went wrong when this error happened. And the author really believes that we actually need entrepreneurs in larger companies, and he believes it should be a job title because of the fact of how important this kind of innovation and kind of just constant feedback loop is, and the whole idea should be brought to like a lot of big companies. I personally found that there's lots of overlap in this book with Principles by Ray Dalio because it talks a lot about how to efficiently structure teams within an organization to support innovation and in order to make you successful in the startup space. And it brings up that there's a lot of waste occurring because of inefficient organizations that do work that isn't necessary, and people are actually afraid to call it out because of the wrong incentives and ingrained work policies. So you think about this. If I pay you by time, I pay you to show up. I pay you to do work more slow. If I pay you based off outcome, I pay you to get things done faster and complete more. What do you mean? I mean incentive-wise. If I just imagine yourself as an employee. If I get paid for X number of hours of work, I want the new project to take as long as possible because that means I'll get paid as much as possible. If I get paid per project completed, I want to do as many projects as possible and finish them so I get more money. Those are the incentive structures. And now when you start to understand that, you have to start to understand why 9-to-5s are so bad for companies in general too. And that it's almost better to have contractors, but it doesn't really work this way because contractors don't have a lot of company culture and et cetera, et cetera. But Contractors would be better because they're so outcome focused. They want to just get down to the outcome, finish it, and move on because that's how they get paid. But employees don't get paid that way. So as a result, they don't have such a personal stake in finishing the project and instead just know they're going to be there and just get paid anyway. It also brings up that most of management today is based on intuition only and data that promotes hype without actually tying cause and effect together at a deeper level. We talked about vanity metrics, right? And it's saying that management today is intuition with vanity metrics. So just how you feel in the current situation, what you think you should do, plus what your boss thinks you should do. And if your boss thinks you should do something, you think something else, you're going to follow what your boss says. So that also stomps out any critical thinking or reasoning. And the data, that's vanity metrics that show you did something right, like, 5 years ago, and you think that what you're doing right now is causing more growth, but in reality, you're just riding the waves of what you did 5 years ago. And that's what Eric kind of talks about in this book about the real reality of management is just like a mess today. And you got all these people who have to kind of, play these like work politics things with their bosses and, kind of match their expectations. Everybody's afraid to take risks because of the fact that the organization is set up not to take risks. And additionally, they're all using data that just promotes that they're right, or it shows that everything's going well, and it doesn't actually tie any causal effect relationship together. And so as a result, they make a bunch of decisions off of bad data, off of also the fact that they have all these weird pressures coming from their bosses and things. And this just results to kind of the stagnation of a lot of successful companies. And that's why they tend to, teeter out as they get larger and larger. So this was an overview of Lean Startup. If you have any questions, put them in the comments below. Make sure you subscribe for more videos like this, and I'll see you in the next video.